One was this morning again. The format will be as yesterday. There'll be a main speaker who's going to be Jonathan Ott. He'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then Jace Callaway will comment on his talk and his material, and then they'll field questions. So now all we need is the speakers, which will be here. I know they're here. Jonathan already told me he was here. And Jace Callaway.
Good morning. I thought I would be speaking to an empty hall, but thank you very much for coming so early in the morning. I know it's probably not that early for most people, but okay. Any questions? No, sorry. Okay. I'm going to talk about Psychonautica Tryptaminica, or Psychonautica Shamanica, shamanic psychonautics, and especially with special attention on ayahuasca, but generally tryptamines. And I'll talk a little bit about what I call pharmahuasca, or psychonautic modeling of some of the ayahuasca potions, and then extend that into some other related shamanic inebriants based on tryptamines, specifically snuff plants. And then hopefully we'll have time for a little discussion or questions afterwards. I first became interested, as I mentioned in the opening panel, I first became specifically interested in ayahuasca, and or the ayahuascas, I should say, about only 10 years ago, really, focusing on that particular combination. And then I began to have opportunities to travel in South America. And I had always had in the back of my mind the idea of testing this hypothesis about tryptamines, which I used to call the ayahuasca effect, or the ayahuasca hypothesis. Now I call it the Parika effect, or the Parika hypothesis. In 1967, well, let me just backtrack a little bit. I'm going to be talking about the pharmacology of tryptamines, and in the case of pharmahuasca, DMT, or dimethyltryptamine, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and also 5-methoxy-dimethyltryptamine and 5-hydroxy-dimethyltryptamine, or bufotenine. These are very common compounds. We're probably going to discover that they're general metabolites in plants and animals, and that it's not so much that they're DMT plants, but as Sasha Shulgin has said in T-Call, DMT is everywhere, including in our cerebrospinal fluids and in our perfervid brains. And these compounds were first made as artificial compounds, synthetically, in the 1930s in Canada. And the phytochemical study of these plants started around the middle of the last century, and the beta-carbolines, or the compounds that are associated as alkaloids of ayahuasca itself, ayahuasca being Banisteriopsis Ka-P, were first isolated midway through, not the last century, but the century before last, in the 19th century. And in the early 1930s, Richard Mansky in Canada synthesized dimethyltryptamine for the first time, and it existed as an artificial compound for 24 years, until in 1955 it was discovered in the pods of Anadenanthera peregrina, one of the snuff plants that I'll talk about. And the phytochemical data, which I won't be at all specific about, but you can get all this information in my book, Ayahuasca Analogues, from 1994, were found to occur in the potions, which generically people call ayahuasca, although we'll see later on that that's maybe not the best term for them, in the mid-1960s. And so by 1965, 1966, dimethyltryptamine had been found to occur in Banisteriopsis Ka-P-based potions that were called generically ayahuasca, from the source plant Diploteris cabrerana, leaves of which, normally under the name yahi, are added to, or there are other names for it, are added to potions with the stem of Banisteriopsis ka'api. This was first found among the Shuar, and dimethyltryptamine was shown to occur as a component in the potions. Dimethyltryptamine, as I said, was synthesized in the early 1930s, and in 1955 was definitively shown to be a natural product after existing for 24 years without Mother Nature's seal of approval. And during that time, it was decidedly an artificial compound, or what some people call a synthetic compound. And then, lo and behold, it turned out to be found in the pods of Anadenanthera, and then later in many other shamanic inebriants. And so, it was first tested in Budapest about 1956 by Zara's group, and a number of papers were published. And early on, people thought that it was what some people call an endogenous psychotoxin, or something that could explain hallucinations and aberrant visionary effects associated with what some call schizophrenia or psychosis. And so, but it was tested via injection, intramuscular injection, and it produced very rapid and dramatic psychoptic effects. But it was found not to be active orally at ordinary doses. And so up to 1 gram of dimethyltryptamine has been taken orally in a single dose in human beings without producing any particular noticeable effect, although you can certainly feel it in your body at much lower doses, but it didn't go to the head and didn't produce visionary effects. And so when this data came in the mid-1960s showing that dimethyltryptamine would occur in these Banisteriopsis ka'api potions, two Swedish chemists, Bo Homestead and Jan-Erik Lindgren, proposed what I used to call the ayahuasca effect. And that was this. They said that, okay, DMT dimethyltryptamine is not active orally, and so what's happening in these potions is that beta-carbolines from the stem of Banisteriopsis ka'api, which are another kind of tryptamine, are monoamine oxidase inhibitors. That is, they inhibit an enzyme called, for short, MAO, peripherally. We're not talking about the brain here, but in the digestive system in the liver. They inhibit this enzyme, allowing dimethyltryptamine to survive first pass metabolism and absorption and make it into the bloodstream and be transported to the brain. And this was a rather novel hypothesis that was just trying to explain phytochemical data that had come in on these potions. So we have something like, this will surprise many people, only about 12.5 analyses, chemical analyses of Banisteriopsis potions. And we see the following profile, and these are just average figures. A typical dose of the potion, which can vary anywhere from about 50 to 60 milliliters up to about 250 milliliters, given the strength and concentration of the potion, would contain on average approximately 160 milligrams of beta-carbolines and roughly 30 milligrams of dimethyltryptamine. And the range for these 16 potions is, on the beta-carboline, something like around 20 milligrams up to about 450 milligrams per dose of beta-carbolines. Principally harmine. Normally in the potions you get a profile of 3 parts harmine to 1 part tetrahydroharmine with only trace amounts or none at all of harmaline, which does not seem to survive the cooking process, especially where the ayahuascas are cooked, because harmaline is generally the second most important alkaloid in the stems of Banisteriopsis themselves. And also a range of about 25 to 35 milligrams of dimethyltryptamine per dose, with an average of about 30. And so Homestead and Lindgren proposed this in 1967, by the way, in a U.S. government publication that it came from a conference held in San Francisco in 1967 in January, called Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs, which was organized by the National Institutes of Health, then under the auspices of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And it shows just how much times have changed, that in 1967 it was possible for the U.S. government to, bureaucrats basically in the scientific apparatus, to organize a conference on this subject, and without having their heads chopped off literally or metaphorically. And the publication that they came out with, which is one of the great bargains in entheogenic literature, $4 for a hardcover book, and the book is called Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs, is where we have the first data on this subject and some really key points of early data, which I'm not going to be able to go into very specifically. So I call this the hypothesis of the ayahuasca effect, and this was published in 1967 and more or less seconded in 1968 by other scientists working in the United States that were verifying the content of dimethyltryptamine in the potions. And if someone can ingest up to a gram of dimethyltryptamine orally without experiencing psychoptic effects, then how on earth could 25 to 35 milligrams per dose in an ayahuasca-type potion be psychoactive or visionary or psychoptic? And the theory won the day. It elegantly explained the very limited, admittedly, phytochemical data on these potions, and yet it was not ever studied in any kind of systematic way until in the early 80s, Dennis McKenna, who spoke here yesterday, working in Canada, showed for the first time that ayahuasca potions were in fact MAO inhibitors in standard lab assays of monoamine oxidase inhibition, and of course many people had experientially shown, discovered or found in their own bodies, in the alembic of their own brains, that these potions were indeed quite visionary. And some more years went by, and then by fits and starts, different people in the entheogenic underground, the basement shaman demimonde, began testing this hypothesis, and a number of people have reported here and there bits and pieces of a theory about this. So when I finished my book Pharmacotheon in 1993, that was published in the summer of 1993, the ayahuasca chapter in that book was growing and growing and growing sort of in a snowballing way, and showed signs of hemorrhaging into a book itself, which it eventually did. And so before 6 months had passed, I'd written a second book, just taking that ayahuasca chapter and expanding it. And I embarked on a rather ambitious series of what I call psychonautic bioassays, which is a kind of a drug speak jargon way of saying, in the context of drug abuseologists, that you're doing some kind of a self-experiment, or as it's known in Europe, in German, a self-experiment or a self-test. It sounds a lot better than, whatever, psychonautic bioassay. You can almost talk about it in front of people and they go, oh my God, you do psychonautic bioassays. And so what I did is my approach to all this, and I'm going to really talk about psychonautics here, is to get as much information, and this is always important in any kind of research, as much information as one can. And that would be, in this case, of a linguistic nature, of a phytochemical, or the levels of different alkaloids in plants and or extracts of the plants that are used in shamanism, and ethnobotanical. Those are especially those three pillars, really important sources of information for this kind of thing, so that you can design a meaningful experiment, because by its very nature, doing a psychonautic bioassay is, of course, the essence of subjectivity. And, of course, in the world of science, you have this pretense of what's called scientific objectivity. And personally, to me, that is just a pretense, and it's not very meaningful. And science, in its worst forms, has become a type of a religion, a creed, and a belief system. And often things are shoehorned into that so neatly and precisely that you have real grave doubts about the whole process itself. But many people will criticize this, saying, well, obviously you cannot do a self-experiment because that's just too subjective, it's not objective. But in this case, the very subject that we're interested in is the subjective human experience of inebriation, to which no animal model, no surrogate animal model can speak clearly nor authoritatively. And indeed, in the phytochemical research area, it's only once has it happened that using a kind of a laboratory bioassay based on animals has a visionary compound, shamanic inebriant, been isolated, and that was salvinorin A in the mid-1980s or the early 1980s. At the turn of the 19th century, the first of these types of compounds, which was mescaline from the peyotl cactus, or Lophophora williamsii, was isolated in Leipzig by Arthur Hefter. And I call this kind of psychonautic bioassay work the Hefter technique, because Hefter was the first one to use a human bioassay himself to guide the isolation of an active compound. And Hefter really pioneered this area. And this is an important question for two reasons: efficiency and ethics. If someone is a psychonaut, and by the way, the word psychonaut, as I mentioned the other day, was invented by Ernst Jünger, the late, great German writer, to describe someone that voyages in what he also coined the psychocosmos, or the universe within, so to speak. And so if you just are a basement shaman or a psychonaut, you can go down in the cellar or out in the garage or in the room next to the dance studio, as the case is for me, and do something, and within a couple of days you can get really hard data and really, not that it's hard to get, I mean, that tells you quite a bit about the pharmacology of these compounds, and this sort of thing is very difficult to tease out of animal experiments. And sometimes you cannot see this effect very well or at all in animals, and they don't speak to us in a language that, well, at least the objective scientists can understand. And so it's really easy not to be able to see the forest for the trees and to miss these kind of signals. The ethical question looms large here because I'm not per se opposed to the use of animals in scientific research. Well, somebody's rappelling down the side of the... on Sunday morning, that's really remarkable. I'm not per se opposed to the use of animals in research, but, and in this case we are animals, I mean we're human animals, but it's simply the only ethical way, as Sasha and Ann Shulgin have elegantly outlined in their books PCOL and TCOL, is to employ the Hefter technique or the Shulgin technique, the psychonautic bioassay, because the alternatives are either to use animals in a laboratory and not get any really solid data and to be able to miss things such as happened with mescaline and psilocybin in attempts to isolate that. It was only by human bioassays that Arthur Hefter and then Albert Hofmann after him were successful, even though they had better financed competition using the standard animal bioassay model, and some kind of a head start as well, several years in the case of the mushrooms and about 10 in the case of peyote. And so the ethical question is really important, and as the Shulgins have outlined, the really only ethical way to do this is for the lead researcher, or her or himself, to do the primary research in her or his own body, and then you can establish if there's any particular danger before you start dosing prisoners with one of your extracts, or opening up a free medical clinic in the Rio Xingu in Brazil, or something like that, in order to surreptitiously test these things in human beings. So I'm kind of making light of this, but in fact, this visionary plant demimonde, or this subterranean world of a black market, because these compounds are often illegal, has made really significant discoveries and key contributions to the science that we've been talking about some here, especially in this area. So it happened that, as I said, by 1967, this theory was published. By the early 1980s of the ayahuasca effect. At least ayahuasca was shown, in fact, to be a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, to have this effect measurably in a kind of a laboratory bioassay, not involving, in this case, whole animals, but something like a rat liver cytosol fraction. And then, but it remained for human beings to try this, and the only ethical way to do that is for someone to go down and test it himself or herself. And so I assembled the literature on ayahuasca, and the model that I was making I called Pharmacology. And what that means is I was trying to assemble an analog, or ayahuasca analog, which is also a term coined by Dennis McKenna to refer to, in that case, not to a plant extract, but a mixture of different beta-carbolines and tryptamines, mimicking what was found in the brews that he had been analyzing, or his group had been analyzing. And so I decided to construct an ayahuasca analog model for pharmacological purposes in myself. So I assembled all this data. I got what I said. We have 20 about to 450 or so milligrams of beta-carbolines per dose of ayahuasca potion, and then 25 to 35 milligrams of dimethyltryptamine per dose. So it took me about a dozen psychonautic bioassays to zero in on the basic pharmacology. And then when I published Ayahuasca Analogs, there were already a total of about 3 dozen bioassays reported that have since been expanded greatly. And so my approach was to start very systematically with the lowest amounts found and then work my way up, doing no more than a couple of experiments per week. And this is rather slow going if you're working by yourself. And I've noticed some people have so much enthusiasm for this psychonautic bioassay work that they want to do all the bioassays right the first day. And okay, now it works by smoking it. Let's try it orally, and then next 15 minutes we'll snuff it up. But it's not quite that easy. In order to get some meaningful data, you've got to take this a little more calmly and rein in the horses, so to speak, and not get carried away by your own enthusiasm. And so what I found was it took harmine being the principal alkaloid that's found in actual Banisteriopsis potions. One's extracted. I fixated on harmine, which I isolated myself from Paganum harmala seeds, from which it derives its name and was first isolated in the middle of the 19th century. And then I had also isolated dimethyltryptamine. All this work, by the way, was done outside of the United States. I isolated dimethyltryptamine also from commercially available herb sources and had that as a crystalline compound like the harmine. So I found that for me, approximately 1.5 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, which is the way pharmacologists often express dosages of harmine, was sufficient to render about 25 to 35 milligrams of dimethyltryptamine orally psychoactive based on swallowing capsules of crystalline compounds. It took me about 12 bioassays to zero in on this. So 120 milligrams for me, at the time I weighed a little more than I do now, was a basic dose of harmine, and then 25 to 35, and I used 30 is where I fixed what was approximately the threshold level dose for me to get clear-cut visionary effects of DMT, or dimethyltryptamine, orally. So this, in fact, to my way of seeing it, confirmed or supported, was consistent evidence with the Homestead-Lindgren hypothesis of the ayahuasca effect. Because, to recapitulate, I had said that you have an average of about 155, I think it was, or actually a little bit more, milligrams of beta-carbolines per dose, an average, in the 16 or so of these potions that had been submitted to phytochemical analysis. And so the 120 milligrams of harmine was actually significantly below what was the average figure for the beta-carboline content of these potions. And 30 milligrams was a threshold level effect for me of DMT taken orally concomitantly with monoamine oxidase inhibitors, in this case harmine. And as I said, that is precisely the average amount that has been found, with a range of 25 to 35 milligrams. And so when I published Ayahuasca Analogs in 1994, just about 8 months after Pharmacotheon came out, I was also able to, thanks to the collaboration of Jace, Callaway, and a number of other colleagues, some of whom wished and still wish to remain anonymous, I was able to extend this and publish data based on using alternate beta-carbolines, not just harmine, but also harmaline, and a couple of other beta-carbolines had been tested in pharmahuasca experiments by human beings, and a couple of other tryptamines as well. And so by the time this information was published in 1994, we had a very consistent picture involving about 8 psychonauts that were willing to come forward and speak to this question. And indeed, we found that this hypothesis was very solid, and that it applied generally to some 3 different beta-carbolines that have been tested in these kind of psychonautic experiments, and also to some few different tryptamines. And then I also showed, and other people have since extended this, that non-plant occurring monoamine oxidase inhibitors, such as moclobemide, isocarboxazide, that are used in psychiatric medicine, also can be effective in producing peripheral monoamine oxidase inhibition, such that you can get oral activity of dimethyltryptamine. Now, this is an interesting question, the oral activity of dimethyltryptamine. And many people, since the pharmacology of the tryptamines was very much highlighted by this ayahuasca research, or pharmahuasca research, Unfortunately, many people have assumed that dimethyltryptamine is the rule for tryptamines vis-a-vis oral activity, but it turns out that it's the exception and not the rule. In the Shulgin's excellent T-call, approximately 30 simple tryptamines, and by simple tryptamines I'm saying excluding, for example, beta-carbolines, which is a kind of tryptamine, or LSD or ibogaine, which are much more complex ring structures, but just the ones with the indole ring. And side chains. Of the simple tryptamines, the Shulgins reported on human psychonautic bioassay data with 30 of these, and it turned out that all of them were active orally, with the sole exception of dimethyltryptamine and one other compound, which has not yet been tested orally. So DMT is in fact the exception, not the rule, as far as oral activity. And DMT, of course, would be active orally if one took enough of it, because at some point you will overwhelm the capacity of the enzyme. It's just that I don't know of any other psychonaut that's come forward that's willing to swallow more than a gram of DMT in a single dose on the odd chance that maybe it will be active orally and they'll get some kind of a gold star for showing the first human activity of dimethyltryptamine. But as orally, but see, if dimethyltryptamine is so efficiently deaminated by this enzyme monoamine oxidase, then it is ipso facto a monoamine oxidase inhibitor itself, because it's at the moment that it's being bound to the enzyme in order to be deaminated, well, it's keeping the enzyme from binding something else. But the DMT and 5-methoxy and bufotenine are all a couple, 2 or 3 orders of magnitude, or 100 to 1,000 times less active as monoamine oxidase inhibitors than is harmaline, which of the natural ones from this Banisteriopsis complex has the highest activity. And this was all also measured very precisely by Dennis McKenna and others in laboratory assays that are very much repeatable. And so, unfortunately, a lot of people got stuck on this idea of the importance of a monoamine oxidase inhibitor with DMT, or dimethyltryptamine, and I was often cautioning people not to think too hard and try to fit everything into this mold, or one might miss something important, and it generally was lost in the shuffle. The fact that Homestead and Lindgren had originally published this theory with respect to the snuffs, not with respect to the potions, because the first data that came in on the phytochemistry of these shamanic inebriants that are rich in tryptamines referred basically to the snuffs, and then only in a couple of years later did more information come about the Banisteriopsis potions. And people forgot completely about the snuffs in the shuffle, and everyone focused on ayahuasca or these oral potions, and the snuffs were generally lost. But I'm going to, since the time is limited, and I'm just going to have to really cover the high spots here, I just want to refer to recent bioassay that I've done with what I call pharmapena, which is a model similar to Pharmahuasca, but using 5-methoxy DMT, or O-methylbufotenine, and the other one being Pharmaniopo, which is a psychonautic model of 5-hydroxy dimethyltryptamine, or bufotenine. And so I had assembled, and I have quite a good collection of this ethnographic literature on these inebriants, and linguistic is also a very, very important source of information, especially as we're endeavoring to reconstruct some of this information which is lost in terms of ethnographic use. There are types of shamanic inebriants that we only know through some historical report or some kind of a linguistic connection. And so part of what I work on is reconstructing this and trying to recover from oblivion some of these inebriants. But we find out basically, and what I'm going to talk about here and give you my bioassay data on that, are basically this pharmapena, which are plants containing 5-methoxy dimethyltryptamine, which is the most active so far as we know of these natural tryptamines. And that occurs principally in plants of the Myristicaceae or nutmeg family, especially the genus Virola. And there is a large complex of inebriants centered around Virola, of which far and away 5-methoxy dimethyltryptamine in the actual plant preparations that are ingested is the most important tryptaminic alkaloid. These are used as fumitories, they're used as snuff plants, they're used as oral pastes, and very possibly other forms, but we at least have that. And then the same thing for the bufotenine containing, or Pharmaniopo type plants. You also see that they're used as fumitories. They're used orally, chewed like coca. They're also ingested by swallowing. And you also have evidence that they were used as enemas, and this may have been applied as well, of course, in snuffs. I mean, for both of them. And the enemas is another interesting phenomenon that I've just been researching lately as I finish up the bioassays for my new book, which is called Shamanic Snuffs or Entheogenic Orines. And then another important, I said in my introductory remarks that ayahuasca and nyopo and sebil and apena, the Varroa type, are some of many, many spokes in an elaborate wheel of shamanic pharmacognosy in the Americas, of which tobacco is the hub and the central element around which these others revolve and from which they extend. And ayahuasca or Banisteriopsis is used with all of them, and especially with tobacco. And this is something that's been more or less forgotten. And one of the things that is curious to me is even in some cases of ritual use or syncretic religions revolving around the use of ayahuasca, tobacco has been completely kicked out. And at least in the case of the União do Vegetal in Brazil, which is the largest of the modern syncretic churches using ayahuasca, tobacco is a prominent no-no, and it's almost like the United States as far as that's considered to be a drug of abuse, like LSD and other heroin and cocaine, certainly alcohol. Whereas it's really surprising to me because it's like a black and white, one side of the hand and the other, tobacco and this ayahuasca or Banisteriopsis really go hand in hand. So time doesn't permit me to go into any detail on this, and so I'm just going to give you the goods, so to speak, on the bioassay data on these other tryptamines, and then perhaps if someone wishes to ask a specific question, there will be time for public debate about it, or else you can certainly ask me privately. But I'm about to publish a series of papers on this. I just published the Pharmacology paper, prudently leaving some years between the actual experiment and the publication of the data. Although it came out in Ayahuasca Analogues in 1994, only in 1999 did I publish it in the medical literature, or the scientific literature, or the drug abuseology literature. In this case, in the Journal of Psychoactive Drugs. It was originally called the Journal of Psychedelic Drugs. And so I published a paper on pharmacology, and now I have a series of other papers coming out. The next one will be on pharma-nyopo, or the bufotenine, 5-hydroxy-DMT psychonautics, then pharmapena, or the 5-methoxy-DMT psychonautics, and then pharma-nunu, which is the nicotine psychonautics, and nicotine is a real key factor here. And my book goes into rather extensive detail on the linguistics and the ethno-history of these preparations, and I think it will do for the subject of South American shamanic ethnopharmacognosy what Gordon Wasson's Wondrous Mushroom did for the Mesoamerican, in that it will provide the first global view of this subject, and that's very integral. And people have tended to examine things like San Pedro cactus, ayahuasca, potions, Varroa snuffs, Anodonanthera or Nyopo-type snuffs, tobacco, Jurdema, and quite a large number of others in isolation, as though they were separate phenomena. And to examine Mesoamerica, where I reside in Mexico, as being something separate from South America. But in fact, it's all interrelated, and we have this vast and intricately intercalated and luminous tapestry of South American shamanic pharmacognosy, which is of a piece. It really is, and it has a common development, and linguistically we can trace that, and it's not well reconstructed so far, but that's something we're working on. So I made a model first of the 5-methoxy-DMT psychonautics, which I call pharmapena. Well, it turns out, and I'm only going to be able to give you the data because with joking around so forth, I've already practically run out of time. But we find indeed with 5-hydroxy-DMT, of course, this was also, like DMT, first made as an artificial compound in synthetic chemistry, and only much later, in this case in 1959, some 4 years after, DMT was found to be a natural product, and it was first isolated as a natural product from a Brazilian plant called Dictyoloma incanescens. 5-methoxy-DMT was first reported in fairly recent times to be psychoactive in human beings based on inhaling the vapor of the freebase, and it's also been tested by injection, but it had not been systematically tested in terms of its oral activity per se, and only briefly by Jace, Callaway, and others, and in the context of Pharmacology in the 1990s. And but it turns out that indeed 5-methoxy-DMT is quite dramatically active orally by itself without monoamine oxidase inhibitors. To my knowledge, there are only two. There's only one other reported experiment involving this, and that is in the Shulgin's book Tikal, in which they reported, based on a single bioassay, that 35 milligrams of 5-methoxy-DMT didn't affect oral activity. I know myself to be a low monoamine oxidase phenotype based on extensive, meaning that I have lower monoamine oxidase levels peripherally than the most people do, and so. This could explain some discrepancies in the data, but I know myself to be a low monoamine oxidase phenotype, and I found in myself that 30 milligrams, 5 milligrams lower than the Shulgin's reported experiment, was in fact an active dose per se without any monoamine oxidase inhibitors, and others perhaps require more. And in my shamanic snuff book, I report some 24 bioassays of 5-methoxy-dimethyltryptamine, and it turns out that not only is it active orally per se, but it's very active as a snuff intranasally and also sublingually, and the inhalation of the vapor has already been reported on, and I don't go into this at all. I didn't repeat those type of experiments. But I found that the pharmacodynamics of it, meaning its time course, time of onset, time to peak, duration of peak, and the evaporation of this magical varnish over the world that it affects, to use Baudelaire's apt term, it's actually identical between sublingual and intranasal application. And I've only used the freebase. Many people assume that because of the analogy to cocaine, which is the snuff that we know best in the Western world, the snuff alkaloid is also an exception rather than the rule type of phenomenon, and many people have assumed that you have to have a water-soluble salt, such as an oxalate salt or of these tryptamines, even to attempt this kind of experiment. But no, they're active in the nose and under the tongue as freebases, and in the type of preparations that are made in the shamanic world, that's the way you would encounter the alkaloid, not as a water-soluble preparation. So I found out that the pharmacodynamics were virtually the same between sublingually and intranasally, and the threshold level effect for this, just taking pure 5-methoxy-DMT crystals, is around 10 milligrams applied sublingually or intranasally, and also in the case of affecting sufficient monoamine oxidase inhibition by the Pharmacology type of preparation, 10 milligrams is also the threshold level effect with 5-methoxy-DMT for me. But then I subsequently found that very low amounts, about 10 to 15 times less than is necessary in the case of Pharmacology or swallowing capsules containing these alkaloids, only roughly 3.5 to 4 milligrams of beta-carboline in pure form is sufficient to roughly double the potency of 5-methoxy-DMT under the tongue or in the nose. And again, Banisteriopsis stem, and probably leaves in the past, is added to these snuffs and other preparations, and especially to tobacco pastes. And so with 4 milligrams expressed as freebase of harmaline, 5 milligrams of 5-methoxy-DMT in the nose or under the tongue will affect the same type of result as 10 milligrams will do without any beta-carbolines. And just to summarize, you get a very typical, for me, time course in pharmacodynamics of this type of experiment. It takes, for me, about 15 minutes after snuffing or putting it under my tongue, and I do very specific things that are not very social in order to do a sublingual bioassay to ensure that I don't swallow any of it, because this would distort the effects. And the same with snuffing. It's a little bit difficult to do this in a consistent way, but it takes for me about 15 minutes to get clear-cut psychoptic effects, although I can feel it in my body in about 3 minutes. And even in the case where the dose is not high enough to get psychoptic or visionary effects, you can feel it in your body. And once you become familiar enough with this. So, and then it rapidly builds to a peak in the next 10 minutes or so and holds that for the better part of an hour up to about an hour after the initial ingestion, with then a dissolution of the experience over the next 10 to 30 minutes. And so you have a very nice and beautiful time course, and I love this stuff, 5-methoxy-DMT, which is also legal, by the way. It's, strangely enough, is not a controlled substance in the United States or anywhere else. And so I found, indeed, that I would get a very nice effect stretched out. It's very similar to inhaling the freebase, with which I'm sure many of you are familiar, but it stretches it out over about an hour, and it's and you get much more mileage out of the tryptamine doing it this way. And if you add these small amounts of beta-carbolines with the snuffed alkaloid, the snuffed tryptamine or the sublingual tryptamine, you get, it is pretty much just as potent as inhaling the vapor of the freebase. That is 5 milligrams of 5-methoxy-DMT with 4 milligrams of harmaline or harmine freebase is about as potent as 5 milligrams of 5-methoxy-DMT inhaled as the vapor of the freebase. And but it takes, and then without the beta-carboline, you need about twice as much to get a threshold level effect. And for me, it's about threefold more to get this effect orally by swallowing the compound without taking any beta-carbolines. And so in Pharmacology, you need 10 milligrams of 5-methoxy-DMT with, for me, about 40, but for most people, 60 milligrams of harmaline, as expressed as freebase, in order to get this threshold level effect orally. And that same 10 milligrams will give the same level of effect in the nose or under the tongue by itself. But if you add 4 milligrams of beta-carboline, you drop that down to 5. And so you can get the same effect threshold, 5 milligrams sublingually or intranasally with 4 milligrams of beta-carboline, is roughly equivalent in psychonautic potency to 10 milligrams snuffed or under the tongue, which is roughly equivalent to 10 milligrams swallowed in a capsule with sufficient MAO inhibitor, beta-carboline, and then that is roughly equivalent to 3 times more swallowed in a capsule, so 5, 10, 30. And then I repeated the same thing with Nyopo, or pharma-Nyopo, with bufotenine and another couple of dozen bioassays. And in the book, there are about 65 or 70 bioassays, which basically kept me lying out on the edge of the forest a lot this summer, because I did all this over about a two-month period. And it turned out I was in an inadvertent vision quest, but I'll explain that to someone. And it turns out that the opossum was my power animal. But opossums are really cool, and I don't have any problem with that. And maybe it should sound better if it's an eagle or a bear or whatever. But I'm actually running out of time, so I just want to summarize the information about the Nyopo as well, or the bufotenine. And the bufotenine, oddly enough, was first also the original chemical work and pharmacological work, so-called, was also done in U.S. government laboratories and paid for by the taxpayer in the United States. But it turns out that bufotenine, because they injected it intravenously into convicts and mental patients, which are non-convict prisoners, it turned their faces the color of an eggplant in one case, or the color of a plum in the other case. And so this scared people away from it, and even though the U.S. government saw fit to classify it as Schedule 1, meaning a high potential for abuse and no recognized medical use, in 1967, I don't know of anyone that's abused it except for the scientists that injected it IV into convicts and mental patients, turning their faces the color of plums and eggplants. And except for by fits and starts, a few people have ventured into this territory. But just to conclude, I'll say that I found exactly the same pattern with bufotenine as I had seen with 5-methoxy-DMT, i.e. that you get the same pharmacodynamics sublingually and intranasally. It's also active orally by itself without a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. And the time course of the experience and so forth is virtually identical to that of 5-methoxy-DMT or DMT done in the same way. And I will also say that DMT is active as a snuff and sublingually as well, and is also subject to an approximate doubling of the effects by the snuffing or concomitant snuffing or sublingual application of very low amounts of of crystalline beta-carbolines. So in the case of bufotenine, and I also experimented with inhaling the freebase because that has not been done, but in the case of bufotenine, which is 5-hydroxy-DMT, and it's an isomer of psilocin. Psilocin from the mushroom is 4-hydroxy-DMT. This is 5-hydroxy-DMT. And then you tack on another carbon atom, and you have what we call O-methylbufotenine, or what I just spoke about, 5-methoxy-dimethyltryptamine. So these are all very similar compounds. So I found out that as inhaling the freebase, bufotenine is just as active as 5-methoxy-dimethyltryptamine. As little as 2 milligrams is dramatically perceptible, and I didn't go any higher than 8 milligrams, which is where I first got really significant visionary effects from the bufotenine, which is what I was looking for as my touchstone. From 2 to 8 milligrams, inhaling the vapor of the freebase is very dramatically psychoactive, and I would say that its potency is equivalent to 5-methoxy-DMT. In experiments that have been done with isolated neural tissue, actually bufotenine has twice the affinity for the serotonin receptors as 5-methoxy-DMT, which itself has about twice the affinity of DMT. I also found that they were active sublingually and intranasally and also orally. And in the case of the oral activity of bufotenine without concomitant swallowing of monoamine oxidase inhibitors, 100 milligrams works quite well. And the only published experiment was by Albert Hofmann, who ingested up to 50 milligrams in the mid-1950s and didn't find oral activity. So I started by doubling his prior dose. And then in terms of the snuff or the sublingual application, bufotenine is about as active as DMT, which means it's about 5 times less active than 5-methoxy-DMT via these routes. And also in terms of bufotenine-related pharmacology, if you swallow bufotenine in a capsule with monoamine oxidase inhibitors, you get the same kind of pattern that is seen in the other Pharmacology experiments. And similarly, like with 5-methoxy-DMT, 3 to 4 milligram doses of, as expressed as freebase, of beta-carbolines lead to a doubling of its potency in the nose and under the tongue with the same pharmacodynamics that I described for 5-methoxy-DMT in this type of experiment. And just to conclude, so that we can not get hopelessly bogged down and behind schedule right from off of the bat, I originally entered this field of study involving bufotenine per se with my close friend and colleague C. Manuel Torres of Florida International University, who's a Cuban archaeologist, and I wished for him to be the first person to verify these results with bufotenine, which I isolated myself from anodine anthracite from South America, from Argentina. And I gave Manolo the snuff, which in what was for me a threshold level dose, as snuff, meaning I got clear-cut visionary effects from it, snuffing just a pure freebase compound without any other additive. For me, that was at 100 milligram level, and with the 4 milligrams of beta-carboline, you get that 50 milligrams will render the same level of effect. I wished Manolo Torres to be the first person to try this besides me, because that's why he invited me to collaborate on this subject. He needed a psychonautic model to verify. And so I gave Manolo 100 milligrams of this bufotenine freebase to snuff in Palenque about a month ago. And he got totally blasted out, and what was a threshold dose for me, in fact, turned out to be the heaviest trip that he'd ever had in his life, and including up to 400 micrograms of LSD. And so it worked very dramatically for him, and without any beta-carbolines at all. So unfortunately, I would love to talk about this much more, but we have to go on with the schedule, so I guess I will turn it over to my colleague, Jace Callaway, who's now going to discuss.
My God. That was
Sorry, I'm not very
fascinating.
good at this hour of the morning as far as keeping on topic.
I never thought of you as much as of a morning person, Jonathan. But come to think of it, I don't think I've ever seen you asleep either. It's chocolate, don't worry.
Yeah, no tobacco paste this time.
Well, we certainly covered a lot of territory this morning. I've made a lot of notes, and I hardly know where to begin. I think it's very, very brave and courageous of you not only to do these things, but to talk about them publicly. And one of the things that really struck me as important is your ethics in terms of animal studies, because it really doesn't matter how much you give these animals, they just don't say anything. Not a word, or at least not one that I can recognize. And particularly this pretense of objectivity that you touched on is a farce in science. Heisenberg pointed this out quite clearly with his uncertainty principle some time ago in quantum mechanics, that you cannot observe something without affecting it. So the notion of subjectivity in science is a fallacy indeed, and we should all keep that in mind. And I also like when you talk about taking huge amounts of DMT. I think 1 gram is enough to show that it's not orally active, and no one should bother wasting such a good drug taking more. In fact, I would consider this drug abuse to waste such a fine chemical in such a spurious manner. Personally, I don't do any animal research. I haven't done any in 15 years. But there was one interesting experiment done with ayahuasca in rats. I don't know if you're familiar with that, where some rats were pumped up with ayahuasca, and they did die eventually. They almost exploded, but they did die. And we calculated that this dose would be about 7 liters in a human. Okay, so, and you said the top end was about 250 mils, so that's a quarter of a liter. And I think if there was any more than that, it would certainly just come right up. And an important point here is that the reason rats and mice are used in these kind of dosing studies, where a tube is put down their throat and all kinds of things put into them, is that they don't vomit. They can't vomit. They have no mechanism to vomit, so you can load them right up. Humans, fortunately, do vomit, so I find it impossible to imagine consuming a lethal dose of ayahuasca at this point. And also you mentioned, interestingly, a ratio of about 1-to-1 harmine and tetrahydroharmine. No, I'm sorry, 3-to-1. In my analysis, I've found a few that are about 1-to-1 tetrahydroharmine to harmine, and these are considered to be most exceptional among the people that use them on a relatively informal and fairly objective sort of rating scale. So there's some interesting plays on ratios of harmala alkaloids that influence the character of these teas. I've looked in dictionaries for some of your words, Jonathan, and I just don't find them.
Neither do the cops. Hope I didn't offend any cops.
No. So for you boys in blue, just keep guessing. I also think something that's really overlooked here in our community is the importance of tobacco in shamanistic practices. When Columbus crash landed in the New World some time ago, it was very clear that they were interested in these snuffs that were discovered. Apparently some people tried them. Cahoba was the indigenous name of one in particular that contains dimethyltryptamines. I'm sure they were very interested in the effects shortly after snuffing these things. However, it's a historical curiosity that tobacco comes across to Europe. Personally, I think that they were more interested in the dimethyltryptamines, and asked them to load the boat up, and they said, we don't have very much of that, let's just put the tobacco on there, we have a lot of that. And so the tobacco comes back to the court in Europe, and here they are snuffing and snorting and not really getting off like we did in the New World, but well, something's happening, and sooner or later I'm hooked. we need a little more tobacco, please. And I think this may have been the genesis of tobacco addiction and truly abuse in the Western world. I have a story about a possum that I won't tell. But they're lovely animals.
Really cute. Well, they're kind of snouty and not very hairy, and I mean, in terms of body hair, elongated.
So the possum did not take the snuff, I suppose.
No, but they in the Huichol mythology, the opossum, a female opossum, with her prehensile tail, stole the coals from the fire guardians and secreted them in her pouch and brought them back for the benefit of humankind. So to the Huichol, the opossum is a sacred animal. They don't eat them.
Wow, I didn't know that. We usually just run over them in Arkansas. Well, staying on track, just one other point. I'm really fascinated at the sublingual activity of the dimethyltryptamines. I've never heard of this. I haven't really bothered to check it out like that. This certainly warrants further study, as we say at the end of every report that we publish, no matter whether the results are useful or not. It's always warrants further study to keep us employed. But okay, before I say any more, I'd like to open this up to questions. Certainly a few of you have one or two out there. We'll bring the mic up.
Oh.
We'll just have a short time, please. If you have any burning issues, catch Jonathan a little later. We probably have enough for maybe 3 or 4 people.
I have a conjecture or a proposal, and it kind of draws together a few things that I've heard here. First, from Jeremy, about the molecular biologist, who heard that tobacco, drawing in tobacco here, was willing to serve. And also hearing from Jonathan that many plants are producers of DMT. And I think it might be a very interesting marriage of science and traditional approaches and a very simple genetic modification to make tobacco a constitutive producer, or to boost the constitutive production of DMT in tobacco. And I think that would be a very interesting marriage of science and shamanism, and also kind of a subversive use of biotechnology. That's my proposal.
Great.
Mm-hmm. Next.
Nicotine, by the way, occurs in coca leaf. That's recently been verified. And coca is another thing that's integral to this snuff area.
Nicotine's been found in tomatoes, too, for all you pasta lovers.
I'm not a very scientific person. I have more of a philosophical question. But I found your research very interesting. But I'm feeling a little conflicted listening to it. We've been talking in this conference about ayahuasca as being more than a sum of its chemical parts, on the importance of set and setting, intention, dietas and disciplinas, etc. And what I'm wondering is more of a question of quality of experience. Do you observe these sort of rituals and practices before taking the Pharmacology? And I'm wondering, if not, what are the implications of your research in terms of connecting to the spirit of the plant, or if any of the rituals surrounding the ayahuasca experience are important, in which case. And I'm also wondering, in terms of what Jeremy Narby was talking about earlier today, in taking ayahuasca to connect to the molecular biology of the DNA code, if you get that same sort of experience when you're taking chemical constituents of ayahuasca, but not the plant itself, are you really connecting to the essence of the plant? That's my question.
Thank you. Well, obviously what I've presented here is a reductionist approach, trying to just tease out pharmacology and use pure compounds. And as in terms of ritual use, yes, indeed. I mean, I think that ritual is very important, and I have my own particular rituals, but I don't. It's not important to me to observe anything relating to another culture or another time or another place. I don't have any interest in imitating other people's rituals, and I don't think that they are particularly useful to me. No, I don't find any. I can only speak from my own experience, and I don't have a belief system about this, nor do I have a disbelief system about this. But personally, that's not part of my reality, what you described as plant spirits, or I've never seen anything even remotely like an entity, being, vision, visionary spirit body, anything of that kind. That's not part of my reality. I don't set it aside from reality either. It's certainly part of other people's reality. And so for me, there is, in fact, no difference whatever between taking it, whether it comes from a plant or whether it comes from a chemical laboratory. It makes no difference at all. And in fact, I prefer the pure compounds for rather specific reasons. But I don't, in fact, find that. And it's interesting to me because one of the main interests in contact of what some people have called discarnate entities and so forth, what has catalyzed interest in this, especially my colleague and friend Terence McKenna's and Dennis also writing on dimethyltryptamine, and it's synthetic, laboratory-made dimethyltryptamine that leads people to contact these spirit entities. And remember, I said that dimethyltryptamine existed for 24 years as an artificial compound before it was found to be a natural product. And so does that mean that for someone to have ingested it between 1931 and 1955 when it was found to be a natural product, does that mean that there was something fundamentally different about it before it was given Mother Nature's seal of approval and suddenly found to occur in a plant? 5-methoxy-DMT went through about a 16-year hiatus as artificial compound before it was found to be natural. Methamphetamine and amphetamine were only just in the last couple of years found to be natural products. Valium is even a natural product. Polyester is a natural product. And my book, Pharmacophilia, deals really in considerable philosophical detail with this question of what is artificial and what is natural and what does that mean. But for us to say that a compound is artificial, many people misuse the term synthetic when they mean artificial. Synthetic refers to the means of manufacture. Natural products may be and frequently are synthetic. So the word we really wish here is artificial as opposed to natural, found in plants and or animals. Artificial, not yet found in plants and or animals. And we can only say this provisionally. For example, now we can say LSD is an artificial compound because we've not yet found it in a plant or animal. But how do we know that tomorrow or 10 years hence or 100 years hence we won't? This says more about our ignorance and lack of information about the natural world than it. So there is no difference between LSD and DMT as tryptamines. It's just that LSD is now in that hiatus between having been made in the laboratory and later being found in a plant or animal, which it, I think, inevitably will be. Yes, Dennis?
Well, morning, Jonathan. Good to see you.
Sir.
I have a simple question for you. I'm not going to put you on the spot like the previous questioner, but I was wondering.
I didn't have a soapbox, but
Well, Shogun pointed out. I mean, even the artificial compounds are made by all natural organic chemists.
hey,
right?
I'm natural too, as Sasha says.
But I was wondering in your experiments with 5-methoxy, bufotenine, and DMT, as you know, often with 5-methoxy there's a much less pronounced visual component in the experience, and DMT is very pronounced visually. Where does bufotenine fall on that spectrum in your experience? And my second question is, have you worked with the 4-hydroxy isomer of DMT in this sublingual manner, working also perhaps with beta-carbolines to boost it? If you've worked with that, I'd like you to comment on that a little bit.
Okay, the second one first, which was whether I've used, done these snuff and sublingual and MAOI or monoamine oxidase inhibitor experiments with 4-hydroxy DMT, which is psilocin, or the primary visionary component of the psilocybin mushrooms, and unfortunately not yet. I haven't. That's on the very long laundry list of psychonautic bioassays yet to be done that are going to keep me busy until the end of my days. And the other question was about the visual component of this, and unfortunately, like the case, and as Aldous Huxley reported for himself with his experiences with mescaline, I'm rather a dud as far as that kind of visual imagery is concerned, and I don't get colors, basically, or colored visuals. I have a real poor visual imagination from DMT either. I mean, I get more than perhaps I would from 5-methoxy, so I'm not a good person to comment on that, although I will say I never tell people who are trying it for the first time anything about the visual component, because some few people have reported the same level of colored visions from 5-methoxy as they have reported from DMT, and some few even get more. But generally speaking, Dennis asked that question because generally speaking, people find 5-methoxy to be much less visual component than dimethyltryptamine, and I can speak to the question of bufotenine and where it fits on that continuum. In the body, it feels very much like any other tryptamine, but the visual effects are very different, and I think unique in my experience to bufotenine. And they are, in fact, something that one could miss completely if one were in total darkness, which early on was my tendency to go and make it as dark as possible, or sometimes do this number without pressing on the eyeballs and without scrunching my eyes to get this darkened conditions. But the visual effects are really extraordinary, and the most important one is what I refer to, using Baudelaire's term, as a shimmery magical varnish over the world, which is accompanied by a synesthetic citherism, or a whispery sound that comes with it, and it's as though you can see what people once called the ether, or just see the air between you and some object, and this is only in low light. In utter darkness, you don't see it at all, and in bright light, it's not seen either. And it's very definitely a synesthetic citherism, or whispery sound that goes with it. So it is as though everything is breathing and whispering to you in a low voice, in a very seductive, sensual low voice as well. And there's also a strobe effect, which I've seen somewhat with other tryptamines, but it's very distinct to this in that suddenly it's as though someone were flashing a light on and off. And another one which is very peculiar is that suddenly the whole visual field dims, as though a heavy elevator motor had started up and dropped the voltage. Is very common where I live. I don't have an elevator in my house, but I mean, somebody must have a big one nearby, because suddenly, like the light. But anyway, this happens, and it's as though suddenly the voltage were halved, and all the lights dim, and so forth, and then they go back up again. And this is something that I'd not experienced before. But yes, there are the kind of I normally refer to geometric or arabesque colored patterns, and to me that's our linguistic patterning projected onto the world in our attempts to name things. In a way, we try to make order and patterns out of anything, and to me that's what those patterns represent. But this does occur with bufotenine, and it's rather on the end of the 5-methoxy DMT, I would guess, in the continuum. It's not especially colorful, although Manolo found it to be so, and he does have more of a visual, colorful visual imagination. Like, I don't have vivid dreams, and I don't have nightmares, so I'm not a good person to speak to that question, but what I was looking for in my psychonautic bioassays was getting to that threshold of actually seeing colored patterns, and they were arabesque as opposed to geometric, such as I had seen with the snuff itself, the Seville snuff, starting with the Anodin Anthracite in South America. Yes, please.
Okay, I'm sorry, but I've been told that we have to cut it off. If you could please catch Jonathan later. And one thing
I'll be happy to answer any questions.
One thing I'd just like to add about this artificial synthetic thing is that what binds us here is a common experience. We're talking about an experiential thing. We all bring something different to that experience. So I suggest that we try to be open to diversity here as we move through. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.